Hi, welcome to another episode of Inclusion by Design, the podcast which talks about how do you bring in inclusion in policies, practices, and programming. In every episode, I meet with social change makers who talk about what does it truly mean to belong? How do we challenge stereotypes? How do we fight the fight to, to ensure real inclusion and integration? Today's guest is Anuradha Kapoor. She's the founding member and a managing trustee of the organization. Swayam turns 30 this year and has worked on domestic violence in India for the last 3 decades. So, Anuradha, welcome to Inclusion by Design.
Thank you. Thanks, Uma.
Okay, so before we start, Anuradha, I would love for you to give a little bit of a description of Swayam, what it does, and a little snippet from your journey in the last 3 decades with the organization.
Okay, so just to sort of expand what you said about Swayam, we don't only work on domestic violence, right? So Swayam is basically a feminist organization. We say feminist, and it works on issues not just of domestic violence but all forms of gender-based violence, right? And also against discrimination and inequality that women face. And this is what our work has been over the last 30 years. The way we look at violence really is how do you address it, not just by working with the survivors, but also with prevention. So it is prevention and cure both. So from the very beginning, we have been working with survivors of violence, whether it is sexual abuse or domestic violence or any other form of violence, sexual harassment at the workplace, any form of violence that a woman faces, they come to us. And we support them with a variety of services.
Okay.
That starts with counseling and then it moves all the way till the end so that they can stand on their own feet. So that's the idea, that's the arc, right?
Okay.
So we kind of handhold them through the court process, make them understand what their legal rights are, also work to try sort of support them if there is any support they need from their families. So then you have family counseling there, and then also skill training if they need anything like that. Supporting them to get jobs. So that's like a helping them at every step so that they can move into a life of independence, right? And another very important, I think equally important with these individual services, and I think probably more, is the group work that we do with women.
Right.
And that is bringing women together, similar circumstances. Mostly women feel like this is happening only to me because most people don't speak about it, right?
Right.
And it becomes it's my problem. But for them to understand that it isn't their problem, this is a societal problem, it's a structural issue, and that you are not responsible. That is one of the biggest kind of messages that we can give them, right? And I think there, when they see other women coming in, they understand they're not alone in this. And also looking at other women being able to deal with it and move on gives them a lot of strength.
And hope.
Yeah, a lot of strength and hope, right? So I think that is a very important space. And in these kind of group activities, we have like a variety. And each one is dependent on who needs what. So for example,
Very customized.
it's customized, right? And over the years, the needs of the women actually helped us design these group activities, right?
Okay.
So, we have anger management, we have parenting, because this is a huge issue, especially if it's domestic violence and marital abuse. Then they come with their children, and single parenting is a huge issue. The problems with the children is another issue. So we have parenting, we have intergenerational workshops. So we are working at all levels to try and address what are the issues that are coming up from them. Mental health, big issue. So that is a very, very important part of our program that we support women with. And to understand their own mental health and, how do you deal with it and how do you move forward with it. So that, and then we work with their children. So it's not just them. We also work with their children because children are the hidden sort of victims, right? So, because sometimes the children themselves are abused. When the women are being abused, they're also being abused. Sometimes it's just it's the trauma of seeing the mother being abused. It's the trauma of being abused, and it plays itself out differently with different children. So we bring them in as well. So we kind of have a holistic view of how we will support the women. And the idea is that they become from survivors looking at their own lives to agents of change at the end of it. So that, when they've been able to deal with what's happening in their own lives, the same time they can support other women like them. So we have groups of a theater group, a music group. We have a magazine called Proyash, where women write about their experiences. We have a group which is basically a group of women who have learned to do casework like we do, support other women like we do. So where they go out in their own communities, and they have become the focal points where women will come and they will get support from them. So we do training on how they can support them. So there is this larger group, music, theater, 5 groups we have, where the women who came in as survivors are now agents of change themselves. And aside from being part of the groups, each individual woman also acts like an agent of change when she brings other women to you. She refers them, she actually brings them to the organization, that you will also get help and support. So that's the idea, is from survivors to agents of change. That's the journey that we look at. And on the other hand, it is the prevention work, right? And the prevention is, we don't want women to come to us ultimately, right? Society has to change. So what do we do there? There we're working in communities where we're trying to, we organize women groups and also organize men in groups. And I think that's a very important area that we started doing about 10, 12 years ago. That, just creating awareness amongst women is insufficient, because the problem lies also with the men. That's where it's starting from.
Gender relations.
The gender relations. So if you don't change how men behave, how men understand relationships, how men, actually play them out, then women changing and women getting empowered is not going to really help, because then you're going back to the same environment. So we've been working with women and men in groups and trying to change, thinking, it's the mindset, So that is at one level. And then a lot of work with, the larger community through awareness campaigns. And then working with the local governance institutions, so that they are also part and understand what is going on in their community and how they can respond to it. So if there are issues that come up, then they are the first point of contact, and they also are responsible according to law, that they should be taking action. So we work with them as well. So that's another level of prevention work, which we do in communities. And then we also have a very strong advocacy area where, when we started out, for example, there was no law on domestic violence. Right. So we were part of the national movement to bring about a law, for example, for domestic violence. But then once the law came in, there are many, it's a really good law, but there are many provisions in the law that weren't being implemented the way it should be. So then advocacy around implementation. So there is that also as part of the work that we do. So it's a really holistic way of looking at violence and looking at how to address it, because there's no one thing that will work. It has to be done across the board.
In this podcast, we talk about the alienation and stigmatization of the community, and how are social change makers like you or organizations like SWAYAM looking at building inclusion and equity by design into programs, policies, practices. So speaking of this community of survivors of domestic violence, if I were to ask you on a scale of 1 to 10, what is the level of exclusion, or how alienated or isolated or silenced do these women feel? Would you be able to give me a ballpark score?
It's a tough one, because I think it really depends on each person's situation, background, there's no one scale, and it also changes. I mean, if you had asked me this question 30 years ago, I would probably have said, 0 or 1. But I think now there is a lot more awareness. So I would say that there is alienation at a personal level for sure. Very, very strong alienation. I don't want to give it a number, to be honest, because I think That's doing injustice, because there will be some at the zero still, and there will be some maybe at 6, 7. And it also depends where they come from, what is their background, what is their social standing, what is their individual. And I think this is more important than anything else, is what is the individual agency that woman has? Because you can have two women from exactly the same backgrounds, but you will see differences in the two of them in terms of how they deal with the situation because of what they want to do and their own agency. And I think that's a very important point as well, as to how that individual woman deals with it. Because if she decides she's going to make a go at it, there's nothing that can stop her.
So what helps in this decision thing that, okay, I'm going to fight this fight?
I have been trying to answer that question for a long time. What is it in that one woman who decides to do it? It is something internal. It is that internal kind of, I'm going to make this work, or I'm not going, I can't make this work. And so what our job really in Swayam is to make sure that the ones who say, I don't think I can make this work, is to bring that confidence back. That self-confidence that is so totally lost when they come to the organization, is to bring it back and say, you can do it, And that's a lot, the counseling and the group work actually helps a lot in bringing back that strength. Because when they come to Swayam, they're pretty devastated. They're depressed, they're low, they don't think that they can do anything right, because they're constantly being told, this is happening to you because you did this.
Yeah.
You are wrong. And nobody around them is saying it's not your fault. Everybody is saying adjust. Everybody is saying this hota hai, this happens. So adjust. So when they come to you, they're in that situation. And now for them to come out of it is half of our battle, is that. And once that woman is ready, when that flips, she runs.
Can you give me any one? I know in the last 30 years you must have dealt with many such cases, but any one case that really stands out for you, where there was a transformative power of including her in a program and she feeling that I'm going to be able to do it, and then just things change.
I have a favorite story, because she is one of the first women I dealt with. So I will go back to her, like I'm going back 30 years. When she came to the organization, she was like, she had been abused by her husband when she was pregnant. He had kicked her on her stomach. She'd lost her baby and was in the hospital, and then her husband never came back. She had to go back home. She was really badly abused. So her father brought her to Swayam. And I remember in the counseling room, she and her father were sitting, and she couldn't even lift her head up and look at you. She was just sitting there crying, and the father was talking. She did not say a word. So she came at that level, and then through counseling, involving her in support groups, involving her in the theatre group. Today, she is like part of our theatre group. She writes in Proya. She is like, goes out into the public and does public speaking, and she's acting. She's like changed, totally changed, and her life has changed. She is self-dependent. She's earning her own living. She's living as an independent woman. So from a woman who couldn't even talk to this woman, it's just that she got the support that she needed, and she had the inner belief that came out through constant kind of support and seeing other women around her. That made her move like that. And we've seen umpteen stories like this. That, when they come in, they really feel like, I can't do anything. But they are the ones who find the solutions, mind you. We don't have the solutions. We can only tell them, this is what can be done. These are what your rights are. This is where you can go. But the ultimate solution is different for each woman. She has to find it. And that's what they do. And then they, I think rediscovering the joy of living is another thing. To really rethink that I can live a life. I'm entitled to live a life.
Yeah.
And I want to live that life, and then I'll work towards it. And all said and done, it's like agency is also not something that, something happens and then you're like that forever. Agency can also happen in little bits. I might not be able to change my entire life, but I changed part of it. That's still a movement, right? So we can't expect every woman to be like her, the one I talked about at the beginning, right? It could be some walk half the distance, some walk 3/4, some walk 1, but every step makes the difference. right? And also, you can move 5 steps ahead and move back too. That also happens. So there is a constant back and forth because, society is not there to help you. It's really there to keep pulling you back. So you have to have a lot of strength to be able to move ahead.
Healing is never linear anyways.
It's never linear, exactly. So I think that also we need to keep in mind that it's not as if somebody reaches somewhere and is forever like that, but it's a back and forth. But there is a huge movement that happens.
So, Anu, I would like to understand there are certain myths and stereotypes, that people have about victims of domestic violence or women who've been through domestic violence or gender-based violence. And you've often talked about that it is, there are the assumptions, the biases that lie in the society, and it is these assumptions, these prejudices, these biases, these stereotypes that actually alienate women. So a woman who is facing domestic violence or who's experiencing domestic violence is a type. Usne kuch kiya hoga. Usne, you were talking to me about this earlier, before we started the podcast. So can you share a few of these stereotypes and judgments and biases that you have been challenging and fighting and reframing, retraining some of these stereotypes and biases, if you could talk about?
I think if we're talking about violence, right? If it is sexual abuse, then it will be she asked for it. Okay? So if a woman is out at night and she gets sexually abused, why was she out at night? Or what were the clothes that she was wearing? Why did she have to go out with boys? So it's always her fault. Now, I find it amazing how women are blamed for the violence that they face, right? The perpetrator, the man, is never questioned. Why did you do this? What gives a man the right to sexually abuse a woman because she's out at night? There's nothing that gives him that right. But society doesn't question him. I mean, and if you look at any reporting that happens around sexual abuse in the papers, you'll know about the girl, how many boyfriends she had, how many men she had gone out with, where she lives, what kind of clothes she wears at school, everything, right? Although she's not supposed to bring that out, but that will come out. But that man, what about his history? How many women has he abused before? Do we ever get to hear that? So the bias is about women should be within the home. If they're out, they're fair game. So it is like a woman who is out of the home is entitled to get abused.
But so many of the women that you work with, right, this is happening in the domestic.
Yes.
So what are the biases and judgments against her?
So I'm trying to expand only because we don't only work with domestic violence.
Yes,
so I
true.
just wanted to bring in that perspective. But if I'm looking at it within the home, okay, if something goes wrong, it must have been her who did something wrong. She has to put up with it, right? So if the man abuses her, he will tell her, you didn't make the tea right. That's reason enough for you to get abused, okay? Or you didn't say something correctly. Or, we've also had people who've come in and said, I put the glass there instead of here, and that resulted in abuse. Or if I express my opinion. I mean, there is a case which came to us where the woman told her husband, I don't think that this child should get married to this person who you've found for her. And he just picked up the, what's it called? The pressure cooker and hit it on her head. She had 32 stitches. So it doesn't matter. Actually, this is an excuse. Anything. Women, so the blame, that stigma is women should not speak up, basically. So if you do, you're stigmatized, then you're not playing up to that role, in a sense. So so anything that happens that goes wrong in the family is the woman is responsible. And if you leave that situation of abuse, then the stigma is yours. The abuser is not going to be like the man who's abusing you is not going to be told why was he abusing. But that you had to leave. Now, ahare bichari, there will be also that what did she do? Why did he do this to her? She must have done something. And she's fair game. That's the other thing. She's fair game. A lot of women who came, when I started working, I can never forget. I was at that time volunteering at Cine. I hadn't even started SWAM. And there was this woman who was telling us about how she was being abused regularly by her husband, who was a drunkard, never worked. She was working, running the house, and he was beating up on her every day. And I just asked her, I said, then why are you still with him? You're independent. And she said one thing which never left me. She said, I can leave him, but the moment I leave him, there will be 30 other men who will be around me. He's my protection from them. So a woman who is divorced or deserted is fair game for other men, right? So that is the other thing, that she is a loose woman. Once she's out, the stigma is also about she's also loose and available now, right? So there are many, and the family honor part of it also comes in very deeply with domestic violence, right? So if my daughter's coming back, my honor has been, the family honor is now being diminished. So the man abusing the woman does not mean his family honor goes. But her being abused and coming back home means my family honor is gone. So that is also another stigma that the family thinks and faces. Oh, their daughter came back. So you see, it's across the board, it is an unacceptable situation. Whether it is this side or that side, the blame and the stigma stays with the women. Across the board for any kind of violence. Even if you take sexual harassment at the workplace, it's the same thing. You know, why is it happening only to her? There's so many other women in the office. It's always about her. It's never about the abuser. And I think we need to shift this kind of thinking from, instead of asking questions of the woman, let's ask the questions of the men who are doing this, of the abusers, as to why did you do it? What gave you that right? You know, what makes you think that this is okay? But that's the main thing, is the shift and the stigma and the blame, and then the alienation. Is that if you're coming back, if you're leaving a say marital home, and now we're talking about domestic violence only in the marital home. The natal home is a different question altogether. But in the marital home, when you come back, then there is the alienation about now you are ashamed that you're back, because you're being made to feel that you have done something wrong. And so then you're not invited out, for example, you know. One of the women talked about, I wasn't invited to my brother's wedding because I was single. You see? So even this kind of alienation, that you're not welcome in places, right? That also becomes a big issue. And apart from marital family violence, there's also the violence that women face in their own parental home. And that is the beginning of the violence, right? Which we don't talk about. Whenever we talk about domestic violence, we talk only about marital violence.
Quite synonymous with,
yes,
okay,
right?
Yes.
But the violence actually starts in the marital home. And that violence is very severe but not talked about. And what that does is, like, you know, if you're born as a girl child, that in itself is a problem. It's a stigma, right? And if you happen to be the only girl child, it's a problem. If you happen to be one of the two girl children, that's worse. If you're the second of the two, that's worse. So being just a girl child in itself is a stigma, is a problem. And then as you're growing up, the kind of restrictions that you're facing in your life, you know, in terms of mobility, in terms of education, in terms of all other access to your rights, you know, or opportunities in life. And at the same time, you're facing physical and emotional abuse. So many women are like face in their parental home very severe mental abuse. Things like, you're not good enough, in the sense you're dark, you don't look good, who will marry you? These are regular things that women hear, right? So what is the impact of that violence? No one's talking about that.
Those cases actually, very few women who
They
face
will not
this,
even
they don't
think of
come
this
this
as
one.
violence, right?
So only when this happens in the marital home.
Or when something worse than that happens. So if this kind of thing is bringing down their confidence, their self-confidence, their self-esteem, all of this, at the same time, there is physical abuse within the family. There is sexual abuse within the family, which nobody talks about. And this is all in the parental home, before they are going to the natal home, to the marital home. And when you're looking at it like this, that the very people who they're the closest to their parents, right? Or their siblings. They are the ones who are perpetrating this abuse. But there is love there as well. There is this feeling of I'm loved. This is my loving family. But in this loving family, this happens as well. ये भी होता है. So a relationship of love can have both violence and love in it, and it gets in kind of fused in the relationship. And for them, the expectation then is a relationship, a normal relationship is one where there is both. So you're normalizing the violence. So when they move into, say, the marital home, when they face violence, there's nothing new to that. They've already faced it. And so to recognize it as violence and then to take action against it is also very difficult. And in the natal home, taking any kind of action against your parents is like unthinkable. And when, on the few occasions when women do want to take it, when they go, say, approach a police station, then they'll turn around and say, your parents know the best for you. You know, what they're doing is right. So you are not going to get any support because the parents know best. So when you are with the parents know best. And so you're in this situation of starting out like that, then you go into the marital home, then you get abused, and then you come back here. But you're not accepted when you come back. Right? Then you're expected to live on your own. You're supposed to take care of yourself. But have you prepared me to take care of myself? Have you educated me? Have you let me work? Have you let me stand on my own feet so that I can be economically independent? Have you taught me to think? Have you taught me that mobility? Have you taught me how to do things for myself? You haven't. But when I'm in trouble, you will not stand by me. You will tell me you stand for yourself. So it's a really vicious cycle of violence that domestic violence starts in the natal home, carries on there, and then comes back again if they have to leave that. And it's a continuous cycle, which is, I mean, I think we really need to look at what the natal family is doing to women and hold them accountable. It's not just the marital family. It is also the natal family.
I think what you just said, that, bringing this up all against your parents, it becomes very, very difficult. In my work with sex workers, often when there is domestic violence and, violence at home, sometimes they've said that, Rini, report nahi karna. I mean, he loves me, what you were just saying. And even if she's reporting it, somewhere she tells herself that, or if she's unable to report, she's telling herself that, he loves me, or I'm a sex worker. At the end of the day, shayad, this is my, like, a punishment. I have, it's an internalized stigma. It's an internalized judgment she has for herself. Yes. That maybe this is my only redemption. So this is something that I've heard sometimes, very few of people even talking about. But I'm sure you've also experienced women who have this internalized stigma or guilt about coming up with,
Especially with parents. I mean, most of them will not take any formal action. They will just want an informal resolution. But guilt is inbuilt. How can I speak out against my parents? They're my parents and they love me. This whole business of conflating love and violence together is a problem. And interestingly, though, the kind of violence that women face from their fathers is very, very high. And we normally think about, daughters and fathers have these great relationships, but actually, the relationships between fathers and daughters is not that great. Mothers and daughters have a much better relationship than fathers and daughters, and they are very, very abusive. So I feel, and that's not surprising, because if you look at it, men are abusive generally. If you look at the abuse portion, then it is the men who are abusing women, right? So in that sense, women as in their partners maybe, and then women as in their daughters as well. So it goes across. The abuse is very, very violent, even within the natal home, which we don't talk about. We're not looking at the ramifications of that abuse. Whether it is physical, whether it is sexual, whether it is, all of these exist in the natal home before this woman is getting married. And oftentimes women run away from home just to escape that and get married and then get into an abusive marriage. So they think, okay, if I can get out of here, I'll get into it. But it's another cycle that they get into. So It's again, I think it's a very underexplored and under discussed topic, but this is something that we really need to look at in domestic violence as a very significant and severe form of violence that women are facing within their natal homes.
So, Anu, let's come to the systemic part of this entire thing. So, Swayam and organizations like Swayam have been working on policy advocacy and law and policy advocacy for the last 30 years or even more. Has the needle shifted? What has the systemic policy level changes been? Where has it remained stuck? Where has it moved? If you could share a little of that.
I think that, the women's movement has had an amazing impact on ensuring laws for them. And in the last, 35, 40 years, lots of laws, whether they were around rape, sexual assault, sexual harassment at the workplace, domestic violence, child sexual abuse, a plethora of laws. And some of these laws are really good laws.
Okay.
For example, the domestic violence law, it wasn't exactly what we wanted, but it was still a strong law. So it's important to have law. See, law does not solve everything because most women don't go to law. But the fact that there is a law means I have a right, right? And that is important for women to know that this is my right, okay? Because that then helps them to fight, whether they do it legally or whether they do it without going to the court, but it helps them to fight. And it establishes the right for people who do want to fight. So if you don't have a law, you can't fight, right? So I think it's really, really important to have the law, because sometimes people say laws are useless, but I don't think so. I think laws serve a very important purpose. And they also serve the purpose of telling society, look, this is how, whether you think a woman deserves this or not, or whether you think it's a woman's right or not, it doesn't matter because the law says it is. So it's also putting out into society a framework or an understanding that is separate from what society thinks, right? So it's an important role that law plays. But the problem with our laws is the implementation. So whilst these laws are great, what happens in the implementation? When I talk about implementation, I mean, if I go to a court, for me to get to the court, first of all, I have to have the money. There is a legal aid system that is available for women, right? So that also exists. Problem is, how good is it? How capable are the lawyers who are actually fighting my case? And when I go to the court, how gender sensitive are the judges who are sitting there? If the judge who is sitting there feels that women are supposed to be treated in this particular manner, or, I mean, my favorite example is that the judges don't think women need money to survive. So a woman is going and asking for maintenance, and they'll give a pittance. Like, how does a woman survive in that little money? How do they think that she will be able to live on a monthly basis like that? So it's like women don't need much money. So it doesn't matter how much the man is earning, doesn't matter what that person's standard of living is, although the law says very clearly that you will get maintenance based on your standard of living. But the person who is sitting there thinks, yes, standard of living, whatever, but this much should be enough. So you see, that's the problem. The problem is there's a dissonance in when she goes to the police and reports the case, and she says, look, this is what's happening. If it's natal family and she's saying my parents are doing this, parents know best for you. And if it's a marital family issue, then they'll say, these things happen. So, the mindset, how are people dealing with this? So I think that's one level of problem. The second is, even if you're taking law, for example, how long has it taken court for you to actually get a note? It just is an unending process, right? And then when you do get a judgment that might be in your favor, when you go to implement it, that's another problem. Because say, for example, it's a maintenance order. The man says, I won't pay. He won't pay for 2 months, then he'll pay for 1 month, then he won't do. So these are some of the implementational issues that come up in terms of law. Or when you're going, say, for example, to a healthcare facility. You've been sexually abused. How do they treat you there? How do they look at you? So at every level, there is this thing of how women are being treated. And then what is the availability? At what level also? So for example, maybe at the city level, there are a lot more services that are available for women. So you can access some services. Say there may be shelter homes in the city, but they're few and far between. But as you go down to the village level or you go to the district level, there are much fewer services that are available, right? Or they may not even be available. So that's another problem. How many services, what are the services that are available? For example, you're supposed to have one-stop centers. Now, every district is supposed to have a one-stop center. But then it's supposed to have a whole bunch of services. It's supposed to link with all the other services. Do they do that? Mostly they don't. So now the thing is that the coordination between the different services also are not there. So these are some of the implementational angles where the problem lies. And the other thing is that laws are passed. Services are, people say yes, services, but the monies are not good where they need to. You need good quality, accessible services, and they need to be, when I say accessible, it has to be close to where that woman is, right? So you don't have good quality, you don't have accessible, and then they're not looking at the needs of the different kinds of women.
So the budgetary allocations?
The budgetary allocations, so that you have sufficient services which are looking into the needs of all kinds of women. Women who are, not just, women are not homogeneous. They're disabled women. There are women who have different gender identities, different sexualities, who come from different caste backgrounds, who have different class backgrounds. So there you have to look at women as a whole. But you also have to look at the individual needs of these women. Some are coming in because there is sexual abuse. Some are coming in because there's marital abuse. Some are coming in because there's natal family violence. So how do you deal with each of these women will have different needs? How do you accommodate those needs? That also needs to be thought through. So I think, the difficult part of the policy is that policy can be written up. But when that policy is being translated into action, that is where the problem lies. And that has been the issue which we have been fighting for a very long time. That can we have a coordinated, sort of a system which is sufficient and well funded and well, it's like you pay people very little to do the work.
Yeah.
Right?
And it has to trickle down from the national level till
the
village level. So,
yeah, all the way through. So that is not available still. And even the training of people who are running those centers, what is their mindset? I personally feel this is the biggest problem. How do we look at these issues? How do we think about people who are going through this? Because that attitude determines how I deal with them. And what is the kind of response or service they will get from me. So when I'm a woman who is a survivor of abuse and I go to a service and I'm treated in a way that I feel further abused, then it doesn't make any sense for me to go to that service.
It's a barrier.
So it's a barrier. So these are the things that we need to work on because, laws, if it was left to me, I would say, can we just first look at the laws that are there and try and see that we implement each one of them properly? Because that in itself will give a huge, and the services that are available. See, like I said, not everybody uses law.
Yeah.
But there are other services as well. Shelter homes, for example. Or if a young girl is running away from abuse from her parental home, where will she go and study? She needs to finish her education. She needs to stay somewhere.
True.
Where are those homes? Where she can stay and she will be looked after like a young girl would. So it's...
Yeah, as of now, we only get to hear, like there's a parental home, the natal home, then there is this marital home, or there are these shelter homes for women and girls, which are horrendous. I mean, all the Nari Niketan kind of the things. But what you're saying, that, homes that are transitionary for a fixed period of time, for safety, before the person is able to be self-sufficient and independent. These kinds of
also the word shelter for me is a real problem. I always feel we should say residence or homes, not like a house, because the shelter is a very kind of protective word. And if most of the women who are going in there, a lot of them are adults. But those shelter homes treat them as infants, because you are supposed to go and abide by certain rules and regulations and stuff, which is not what an adult woman should have to face. So I think even looking at the larger perspective of how do we look at these homes, these shelter homes? I mean, are they there for women to make a life for themselves, or are they there to protect them, or what are they there for? So we really need to also look at how we look at housing for women. That's the right word, I think. Housing for women in different ways, when they're unmarried, when they are married, when they have children. They have a lot of women can't access homes because they have children who are more than 12 years old, or boys who are more than 12 years old. They won't allow the boys in. Now, how can a mother just leave her kids and go? They can't. So I feel that those are the areas that we need to really look into, as to how do we make these services accessible, and also how do you hold families to account. Like, for example, the husband is not paying up. How do you make sure he does? You know, there is a responsibility. If there's a father or a family there's this young girl who's being abused, how do you make them accountable? Because it's about accountability at every level. The state is accountable because it's not providing safety, and the family is accountable because they're not. So we need to have accountability at every level.
I think one of the very important sector that builds into this narrative is the media. Also, so in your opinion, in your experience, how have the arts, whether it is, I mean, arts, performances, films, theaters, I mean, how have you seen this literature? Have you seen them evolving? How are they building the narrative? Is there anything that strikes you in the art space today? Or
I think if you look at film, it has a huge kind of impact, right? And if you see, there is definitely a movement in films today where they actually are looking at issues in a much more nuanced way than what we used to see before, right? Where in the past, Ahare Bichari women were the norm. The other woman was always demonized. There was this other, and violence was really acceptable. Domestic violence was okay. All of those things. Now, when you see films on domestic violence, they've really progressed and recognizing the different forms of violence, because violence is not just physical. Right? There is emotional abuse, there is psychological abuse, there's sexual abuse, and emotional and verbal abuse are sometimes worse than actually, having physical abuse, because the way they can sort of eat out, and also, take away your self-confidence, your self-esteem, your identity, it can really play havoc with damage. And the damage that it does is very difficult to undo. And I think there have been in the last few years some very, very wonderful films, like Thappad, for example. That one slap, only one slap. But then it raised a huge discussion in society saying, what is the big deal? It was only a slap. Right? But it was talking about it is not acceptable. But I think the one that really worked very well for me was The Great Indian Kitchen, which is like a Malayali film. It's been dubbed into English. And it shows how domestic violence can be without verbal abuse, without yelling, without physical abuse, but the kind of dailiness of just that, the way in which you talk, and what you say and how you say it, the underlying violence is so strong that it comes out. It's brilliant. I mean, so I'm saying there has been some shift there. And even I think, in terms of portrayal of women, you do see some positive portrayals. There are people trying to change norms, but it's not enough. It's like a few. But I think, we really need to work right from childhood. So I think it needs to start in schools. Schools and colleges have to start, the curriculum has to change. The curriculum has to talk about men and women equally, right? And show contributions of women in the same way as they show contributions of men. So I think that has to start, and unless we change mindsets, nothing's going to change. Everything else can be there, but we really need to look at the root cause, and the root cause really is patriarchy and how women are viewed in our society. And until that changes, nothing will change. So, yeah.
I will ask you to leave us with, if you had to give a soundtrack for this entire thing that you just said about the samaj, the society, the women, the men, and what is the song that you would choose? It could be a wish song, it could be a desire. that could frame what you wish the world to move towards?
See, I think the problem is the difference, right? Everybody looks at difference in a way that, instead of looking at difference in a way that adds to my life,
Yeah.
difference is looked at something that, makes my life, I have to fight with the difference
Yeah.
rather than to embrace the difference. So to me, I mean, my song has always been Imagine, John Lennon. Where he says, imagine a world where there is no heaven, there is no hell, it's just the sky above us. And he says, imagine there's no religion and no country, nothing to die for. These differences that we create amongst ourselves, I think that's what needs to go. So, yeah, we need to imagine this world where differences are kind of celebrated, and you learn from those differences. And I always think, if I go to a garden which has only one flower, how boring will that garden be? But when I see a garden with millions of flowers and different colors, it's gorgeous. That's what difference does to us as a society, right? We have all of these different things that we can bring in and make this beautiful garden. Why don't we do that? Instead, we want to take out every other flower that does not look like us and throw it away.
I think that's what true inclusion would be there. You have all the differences and you bring them all together. Thank you so much, Anu. Thank you for speaking to us.
Thanks very much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Inclusion by Design. I hope this conversation sparked some ideas, some thoughts, and some narratives that you will take forward in talking about inclusion, belonging, and empathy. We'll see you in the next episode. Until then, inclusion in action. Till next conversation. Bye.